Brexit, the age of global discontent. This and more in today's market update. My name is Stephen Flood, and today we're going to talk about Brexit and what's happening with this tumultuous political event. It's going to possibly affect every market, every country, every economic bloc in the world, and essentially it's probably going to affect all of our personal balance sheets, for the better, for the worse. We don't know yet, but it's developing over time, and it represents a very interesting development for a whole lot of reasons. Essentially, if we zone in on the UK and the political turmoil that is at work there, we see a frustrated Prime Minister trying to galvanize support for a deal which both camps have significant concerns about. Both camps being the Remainers on one side and the Leavers on the other. Within her own party, the Conservatives, they are also split. Some want to stay, some want to go, and the ones that want to go have not really explained their solution for what leaving looks like, and there's an awful lot of gaps in their representation as to what a good exit looks like, and so you have a heave in terms of the political leadership within the Conservative Party and thus the UK. You have people looking for Theresa May to step down. You have people, putting themselves forward who don't necessarily have the qualifications or won't be able to capture the imagination of the public and garner support across the political spectrum for whatever deal. They don't even know what deal they want, and so it's an absolute and utter mess. And it's a very, very difficult time. On the Remainer side, they're probably not going to vote for any plan that she puts forward because they want to remain within the EU. And so she has to run with the Leavers in that regard, or convince the Remainers that this is the best worst option available. So she would probably, I suppose the argument is that if we don't have any deal, it could be an absolute disaster for the UK economy, being cut off from Europe, and being cut off from many markets around the world. Thinking that most of their trade agreements are through the EU now, and they don't go direct; they're not bilateral. And so if they were to basically fall out of the European Union without a deal, they could be left basically on the high seas and with no friends. And it doesn't matter how good an economy you are or how good you think you might be, without agreements in place, you're going to be a very difficult place to do business with. This obviously has massive ramifications for their trading partners, namely Ireland, and all of the detailed and long-standing economic relations that the two countries have. We are, Ireland to the UK and UK to Ireland they're one of the most important trading links that there are for both economies. On the Leaver side, obviously they don't want to support the agreement on the basis that if you gain access to the EU common market, but you don't have any say in how the rules are formulated, essentially you have a pointless agreement. That means that you're going to be the taker of any new rules, which could be very, very dangerous for the UK, because you could find a competing market such as France or Germany may want to change some of those rules. They will have a table at the top table, a seat at the top table. They may change those rules in their favor against the UK, and over time the UK could lose competitiveness by virtue of not being able to counterbalance those trading and lobbying efforts within the EU. So it could prove to be detrimental for the future of the UK, because they won't be free then to have an alternative to actually set up their own agreements as they yearn to do. The interesting thing in terms of what the political landscape looks like in the UK, obviously Theresa May is in a very tenuous position. The DUP in Northern Ireland, a minority political party in the UK, are staunchly pro-UK. They don't want Northern Ireland treated any differently than the UK mainland, England and Scotland and Wales, and so they won't countenance any change in treatment. But the agreement actually does treat Northern Ireland differently because it protects the cohesion between the south and the north, and it essentially creates a customs barrier down the Irish Sea. This obviously could play very well for Northern Ireland because they find themselves with feet in both camps, and perhaps there's a great opportunity for arbitrage, for being a conduit for trade across the EU. And maybe they could be a very, very powerful ally for the UK in managing any aggression from the EU competing countries going forward. So there's an awful lot of interesting things there. The DUP are very staunch in their pro-UK position and thus against the deal, and thus that means that they might pull their support from the British Conservative Party, thus bringing down the government, opening the door for Theresa May's political competitors such as Labour to step in to the breach. The Labour Party are Remainers, which is, it doesn't sit well with the vote, and should they wish to pursue that strategy, that could create more political turmoil within the UK, where the vote for Brexit will be seen as not being supported, and they could call for another vote as well. They like the EU, I think, primarily because of the socialist tendencies that you have, or socially progressive strategies and policies of the EU, that aligns itself with Labour's own beliefs and manifesto. But they seem to be quite leaderless. Corbyn is somebody who hasn't really come off the fence either way. His utterances have been quite middle of the ground, and he hasn't really shown much leadership in that regard. He talks about just following the will of the party, and so it's interesting to see what's going to happen there if he's thrust into the limelight and charged with negotiating a deal he doesn't believe in against the wishes of the people who voted for it. Perhaps his popularity would wane very, very quickly, and that of the Labour Party. It could be a poison chalice, so to speak, and so maybe he doesn't want to even enter the fray. He'd rather see the Conservatives tear themselves apart and do themselves endless political damage, trying to understand exactly how to go forward and unite. In terms of the overall themes, behind this, obviously locally we have the Good Friday Agreement between Ireland and the UK over Northern Ireland, and that is something that all of the political parties have, and all of the parties to the negotiations have said is a priority, but they struggle to see how the UK could keep its commitments in that regard, but also have its own trading status. So it's an interesting, and it's one to watch. I think it's this massive contradictions at the very heart of that, and I don't see how those agreements are actually something that can be aligned very, very easily. But overall, the other theme I see is EU cohesion. One must ask, why is it that Britain, one of the largest economies in the EU, decided to leave in the first place, and how is it that all the political parties were caught off guard with this vote of the people? And it wasn't by a particularly narrow margin. There was a healthy majority that voted to leave, and I think this actually poses a question for the EU itself as a political experiment. And if you go back to its origins, it started off as an economic union, something to prevent a war in the heart of Europe from happening again, and that's a very noble ambition, and it's been successful. Obviously, most of the European countries have benefited greatly from the European Union membership. Some haven't. Obviously, those with political systems that are very adversarial, such as Italy, have not seen their economic lot improve particularly well, especially over the last 10 to 20 years, and so they would have a lot of anxieties as well. But the UK has benefited tremendously. Ireland has benefited tremendously. Germany has benefited tremendously. Other countries, such as in the Mediterranean economies, have increased their debt load substantially, and therefore their risk. And we found that through the Globalisation global financial crisis when they were under an enormous amount of pressure and their banking systems failed. It would be my belief that that the underlying support for the EU is not as strong as it needs to be if this experiment is to work in the long term and have resilience. We had an event at our office there recently in Dublin. We had about 100 people in the room. I was giving a talk, and I just kind of put it out there. How many people know who their MEP is? And about 3 hands out of the 100 went up. And then I asked, okay, so so that's about right. Most people don't know who their MEP is, and that's worrisome because that means they're not participating in debate. They don't really know what's happening. I then asked, I said, okay, you three, you're obviously well in the know. Could you tell me any major policy that's been discussed within the European apparatus right now as any political decisions? And they didn't know. So there's a huge gulf of understanding between the populations that are supposed to be served by the EU and the people who are going to be affected by its decisions. And that disconnect, I think, in normal times, you will find that it's okay. It doesn't actually. You can go along with that, and it doesn't really matter much. People get along with their day-to-day lives. But over the longer term, when you do have economic cycles, when things do overheat and economies cycle down, and you have anxieties and stresses, political representation becomes very important because major decisions are made. And if people don't feel that they're being represented, then you can have disengagement. And I actually think that with the global financial crisis and what's happened in the world and central banks printing money, I think the middle classes have found themselves on the wrong end of this recent economic expansion. Their lot hasn't improved. I think Britain has a particular form of nationalism which felt disengagement from the EU as being possibly the best way forward, as to take back sovereignty, to protect their local jobs, to protect their streets, their communities from what they saw, the perception being possibly an influx of immigration, refugees from Africa and different places like that in Syria, and they didn't like the idea of having their lot being, as they perceive it, to be further reduced, and so they felt they wanted to take back that sovereignty. And I think you see that in other countries as well. In Europe, there's anxieties there. I think Italy is one to watch. I think maybe Brexit is going to we'll see what's going to happen there, but I think because we don't have a plan for it, it might be a dull affair. It might not be the existential event that people worry. It might be quite dull and plod along afterwards, after they leave. But then I do think that the market will look at Italy, and Italy might want to make a move for the exit door as well. And if that happens, I think people want to get ahead of that trade, and you could find a major panic erupting throughout global markets, and that could be the biggest event and the one that could be the death nail in the European project as we currently understand it to be. Because ultimately, the enormous amounts of debt that have been built up throughout the system make any down cycle in our economics and our personal wealth all the worse. And it means that if we don't have that political leadership, we can't process anxieties, we can't process solutions, we can't sell those solutions to our people, and so taking back sovereignty becomes a very, very attractive option. And then you worry about also the strong men coming in and promising the sun, moon, and stars, and telling people, listen, you don't have to put up with this pain. I have a better solution. Follow me. And ultimately, they're untested, and their policies probably may even lead to even more political turmoil. So it's a very, very uncertain time for the British people. It's a very uncertain time for their neighbours. Personally, I think the biggest story is the actual EU project itself, and I think I would like to see more work done on that within the European countries that are part of it, and I think they need to get behind it if they're commit to it or disengage from it. But they can't have this kind of this nowhere ground, this middle ground where nobody knows where they stand. And I think people would be served better by that. Looking at the scenarios, personally, looking at a bad Brexit, And what that is basically is a deal that nobody really wants, and that's not a kind of happy middle ground. That's a place where the UK loses an awful lot of its sovereignty in order to gain access to a market which may or may not be in its interest. And if that happens, you could find it in an economic malaise where they're not able to set up bilateral agreements with other trading nations around the world, which is their wish, which is the leavers' wish, and then you could find themselves having a lost decade or two where they don't have any economic growth, and also political turmoil where they are infighting and they don't have a cohesion about their foreign policy and their foreign trade policy as well. So that could be an awful thing for the people of the UK. But there'd be no winners either. It doesn't mean that the European competing nations would be winning. They would lose one of the most vibrant economies and one of the most powerful aspects of the European project, which is that Anglo economic thought and engine and drive, and it's such an important part of the EU's success to date. That counterbalance to the Franco-German way of thinking, to bring that to the, to lose that as part of the discussions going forward would be awful for all the EU nations, and definitely Ireland as well, another English-speaking country. I put it around 60% that the chances of a bad Brexit happening, which is very, very sad to say. I think the chances of a no Brexit is 20%, and probably rising at this stage. Because of the political turmoil within the UK Parliament. And then I put the chances of a good Brexit at around 20%. That is to say that they come up with an agreement and they're able to deal with the Good Friday Agreement, they're able to deal with borders, they're able to deal with the customs union, immigration, defence, and all of the sticky points, and also sell it internally where they can have a cohesive political expression that they can take globally. So ultimately, Brexit is probably the first biggest test of the recent phenomena that we know as globalization, where local economies, local communities are affected by global trade winds. And this is, I think, an example of the little guy stepping up and taking back sovereignty and control, and that's a double-edged sword. There's responsibilities that come with that, but I do think that those anxieties also exist in other countries, and political leaders, economic thinkers need to address these concerns. Our political systems need to adapt, and we need to educate people as to the benefits of globalization, but also we need to have a type of globalization that isn't just mindlessly chases GDP, but also looks at communities and people's lots in life, and the issues that they face day to day in terms of employment, in terms of having a future, and having job security, and having financial security, and these are ultimately the reasons people vote. And I would worry that unless our system has those at its heart, you could find more votes like this in other parts of the world, which politically we're not set up for. So that's the viewpoint for today's market update. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our channel by clicking the button below. Subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, and all the other social media platforms that you have. Thank you very much for your attention today. Take care.